So, let's talk about something that's absolutely fundamental to the law of negligence. When someone is careless, where exactly does the law draw the line? Today, we're diving into breach of duty, and we're going to figure out how our legal system decides the difference between just a simple mistake and actual legal negligence.
I mean, we've all been there, right? You have a lapse in judgment, a moment of distraction. But when does that little slip-up become something more? Something that the law cares about? How do courts figure out when simple carelessness crosses that really crucial line into a breach of a legal duty? Well, that is exactly what we're here to unpack. All right, first up, crossing the line. So once we know that one person owes another a duty of care, the very next question a court has to tackle is, did they actually breach that duty? And this is where the whole idea of a standard of care comes into play. So what is the standard of care? Well, think of it as the legal benchmark for our behavior. It's the level of caution that a prudent, totally reasonable person would use in a situation to make sure they don't hurt anyone else. Basically, it's the official measuring stick for our actions. You know, the easiest way to get your head around this is to just picture a line. This line represents the minimum level of care that society expects from you. If what you do falls below that line, bam, you've breached your duty. It's a really simple but incredibly powerful legal idea.
Okay, but how does the court actually figure out where that line is and whether somebody crossed it? It's not just guesswork, not at all. They actually follow a very clear two-question test to make the call.
It works like this. First, as a question of law, the court establishes the standard of care required for that specific situation. They literally set the line. Then, as a question of fact, they look at all the evidence to figure out if the defendant's actions actually fell below that line. They apply the facts to the rule they just established. And this brings us to the star of the show, the reasonable person. You've probably heard of them. This famous, completely hypothetical person is the law's objective measuring stick for figuring out that standard of care. Now, this is absolutely key. The law uses an objective standard. It doesn't ask, did you think you were being careful, or were you trying your best? Nope. The only question that matters is, what would a hypothetical, reasonable person have done in your shoes? And this is so important because it creates a predictable, fair standard for everybody. I did my best just isn't the legal test.
There's this classic old legal phrase that just paints the perfect picture. The reasonable person is often called the man on the back of the Clapton omnibus. They aren't anyone real. They're an imaginary, ordinary person with a bit of common sense just riding a bus. That's the universal yardstick right there.
But where did this whole idea come from? I mean, this objective reasonable person test had to start somewhere, right? Well, the concept was really cemented in a pretty fascinating case from way back in 1837, and it all involved a dangerously built haystack.
Okay, so here's the story. A guy builds a haystack right next to his neighbor's little cottages. People start telling him over and over, hey, that's a serious fire hazard. That thing could spontaneously combust. But he just ignores them, insisting he'd done enough to make it safe. And, well, you can guess what happens next. The haystack catches fire all by itself, and the blaze destroys his neighbor's property.
And this is the court's landmark ruling from that case. It established that a person has to act with the same reasonable caution that a prudent man would have. So the defendant's personal belief that he was being careful enough, the court said that was completely irrelevant. With that one decision, they created the objective standard that is still the foundation of negligence law today. Amazing, right?
But here's the thing, this standard isn't totally rigid. The law is smart enough to know that what's reasonable can really depend on who you are and the situation you're in. One size definitely doesn't fit all here.
For example, a surgeon isn't judged by the standard of your average person on the bus, right? They're judged by the standard of a reasonable surgeon. And the standard of care we expect from a child is, of course, adjusted for their age. So the reasonable person test is actually pretty flexible. It adapts the standard to fit the context.
Which leaves us with one last and I think really fascinating question to chew on. If the reasonable person is a complete legal fiction, a character we literally invented to make the law work, who actually gets to decide what this imaginary person would have done in any given situation? Something to think about.